Hello, this is Doug Copple, and it's time for another reSource Minute. This time we're going to look back at the valuations we prepared in calendar year 2025. Every year we prepared an annual review of the valuation metrics we've done during the previous year, and many practice owners have told us they find this data useful to benchmark their individual practice, and it's also beneficial for young doctors to understand the market when they're considering buying a practice. So here's a summary of the key metrics of the valuations we performed last year. First, please note that these are private doctor-to-doctor transactions. DSOs and OSO transactions are completely different based upon EBITDA, and typically they're usually valued higher or the price is higher, but there's very, very different terms there. So if you look at this chart, the average orthodontic practice that we looked at last year had average collections of $2.65 million. The adjusted overhead rate is just under 57%. Now that's the adjusted overhead rate, meaning that we have removed discretionary or non-operating expenses from the overhead, say family payrolls and things like that. And the average value as a percentage of collections is just under 85% of collections. I want to point out that the majority of these practices, about 60% of them, were actually sold at these values, or a contract has been entered into for somebody to purchase all or portion of the practice at the valued amount. So we think these percentages are fairly representative of the orthodontic space. And these values are affected by a lot of different things. Again, we're looking at averages, but it's based upon the individual characteristics of the practices, primarily profitability of the practice, which we talk a lot about, and that's why we talk about overhead here. It's also the growth trends of the practice, the condition of the office and the equipment, the location, and the total contracts and accounts receivable. So that's just some of the items that we look at. So as always, we always pull 25 practices as a sort of a representative of all the valuation that we did to give you an idea of the ranges here. So this is 25 of the practices that we looked at. You'll see there the second column from the left are the net collections of these practices. And again, you'll see a huge range. I think the smallest in this is $750,000. The largest in this is number 15, $6.5 million nearly. And actually, I think the largest practice we worked with was over $8 million last year. You'll see the overhead rates in the middle column. There's a wide range in these also. You'll see that the highest overhead practice is 80%. On the opposite end of that spectrum, the most profitable practice we worked with had overhead of under 39%, which means that for every dollar collected, over 60% of that dollar, or 60 cents of that dollar, was going to the owner doctors. But again, there's a huge range in that, so that's a 41.5 percentage points difference between those two overhead rates. So again, wide ranges. Also in this year, those two practices with the highest and lowest overhead rates also valued at the highest and lowest amounts. So you'll see that that one practice valued at 45% of collections, the other one valued at 120% of collections. And this is to note that there's a huge range, okay? So that's why we said don't rely on a rule of thumb to say, okay, it should just be 80 or 85% of collections. You hear that a lot. The reality is, based upon all the factors we talked about, it can greatly affect the value of a practice, okay? Just because practice or somebody's asking 70% of collections for the practice doesn't mean it's a great deal. Or if practice is valued at over 100% of collections, doesn't mean it's a bad deal. It's very justified to do that often. And actually the practice there valued at nearly 120% of collections is being sold at that amount, or a partnership, a pathway is being established for that. Now looking at, as we have in every other year or in previous years, we track the number of office locations for each practice valued. And about half the practices that we valued last year were single location practices. As you can see in this chart, practices with multiple locations produce more on average and are more profitable with lower overhead. Again, these are averages. We've had multiple one location practices producing over $3 and even $4 million last year. But the main point is just don't assume that adding another location will increase your overhead. Okay, as in prior years, it typically increases both the top line and the profitability percentages of those practices. So the final chart here is a list of the last 15 years of practice values that we've published. The value as a percentage of collections has steadily increased over this time, while profitability and overhead rates have remained relatively consistent or on a fairly tight range. The overheads during this time period have ranged really between 56 to say 59%, 60% of collections. But the valuation creep higher is mainly due to the impact of private equity entering the space over 10 years ago, and the limited number of practices available for sale in private doctor-to-doctor transactions. So the demand's still there for sellers to sell their practices, and buyers can still do extremely well purchasing and owning their own practice. We do have a more detailed summary of this on our website if you want to download it from there. So that's the reSource Minute we thought you'd like to know.